Alrighty. Well, we got 95 now, so I'm going to take that as my cue to go ahead and run with it. Today we're going to be, for those of you who are unfamiliar with content we're going to cover today, we're going to go over the transition of the cases and contacts that we make calls to for interviews. Everyone does for the assessments. We're going to go over what happens after they leave our assessment calls and what happens after the fact with the guidance and the monitoring, exposure notification, with a particular emphasis on the monitoring, which you're about to learn is, as far as our perspective and what role we play in that. We have teams, including mine, that make SARA alert calls. And yeah, so hopefully at the end of this, you'll have a better understanding of how this process works for all of these folks that you make calls to, what their experience is like after they are done with their phone call with you, and how important your role is in making sure that they move to that next stage and get the help they need and the daily monitoring they need so that they can have the best possible outcome. The first thing we're going to start with here is a little multimedia presentation put together with a story by Nicholas Hagen. Yeah.
Sometimes I question the real impact my work has done on the micro/personal level. Did they get the help and resources they were looking for? Are they okay? The job doesn't always have such clear-cut facts and figures when you want to get those questions answered, so it leaves you in kind of an emotional wilderness thinking, did I do everything I can for this person or this family? On the macro level, as a collective, we've done amazing work. From the principal director of this project to the newest hire, everyone's role is necessary and has had an impact on this pandemic. We have testimonials, COVID-19 numbers, and extended contracts to prove that. Duh. But what about my people? What about my SARA cases? Did I help? Did I make a positive dent in their life? That sentence above kind of always nags at me a little. It's human enough. Most times, you won't know. However, like this case, sometimes you gotta get a clear answer. Shout out to Olga on this one. And that's okay. If you have those feelings, it means you're right for the job. You care. You care enough to think of the folks who are going through some real pain. And you realize that every phone call is important because you never know what the future holds. One thing to zen out on is reformulating your thinking from did I impact this person's life to how did I impact this person's life. Did means you're questioning your own abilities, the process of your work and abilities. Imposter syndrome-esque questions. The how gives credit to yourself for making the attempt of helping. It takes into account you reaching out. It takes into account that sometimes a phone call and asking someone how they are is exactly what they wanted and needed. I'll end with this memorable monitoree. They were 19, about to head to college during the second wave, visiting family. They tried to be as safe as they could be, but unfortunately everyone got infected. And even worse, she was in the hospital. Lungs had been failing, coma for a day or two. I braced myself for the worst. Made the call. I got a real chipper, hey. It was a strong, confident young voice on the other line. I asked myself, did I dial the right number, or is Twilio just being rude and dialed a totally different number? I'm not crazy. Twilio has a history of gaslighting, and you know it's true. Come to find out, they'd whooped the butt of the lung issue and were out of a coma. Their family was all good, still isolating, but in good health and happy this monitoree was doing all right. I was so relieved. I monitored them for about a week. Come to find out, they were admitted to my alma mater, the Evergreen State College. They just got into old grunge bands, and they developed a real bond with the nurses who snuck her Skittles in all the time. They just like me because I'm really cool and I showed them all my TikToks. It's hilarious, said my monitoree. They reminded me so much of my little sister, it was insane. And after our monitoring calls had ended, I reminded her to check out some necessary bands to listen to. Netflix recommendations while they recovered at home, and the 411 on some great professors at Evergreen. We both sniffled a bit and hung up. Never heard from that case again. All done. Now, why bring up this story? What the hell did I actually do? Talked about college and some snacks? What's the point? The point of our work is multifaceted. Investigator, counselor, resource coordinator, etc. A lot of hats you gotta wear. The hat I wore was someone that this case could talk with while they were alone in the hospital through a traumatic event that took place. I represented the state of Washington's response to a global pandemic. I represented contact tracers, and I also represented just another person caring about and listening to another human being. And sometimes that's all someone needs. Not always, but sometimes.
Well, thank you, Nicholas, for that. That's pretty fantastic. I really grateful for that. So now, as we jump into the meat and potatoes of the content we have to cover today, again, like I said, we're going to talk about the transition from the assessment interview calls with cases and contacts that we've all been making for months now. We're going to talk about a few terms we're going to address at the very beginning.
Brian, your sound went off.
Did you get anything that I said after the?
I think restart the introduction, Brian. You went
Okay.
mute.
Okay. But you got the entire presentation, Nicholas. Did you get me thanking Nicholas for that?
We did. Yep.
Okay. Well, then I'll just jump into this. I'll just say our learning objectives for the day are going to be start with some key terms, some of which you're all familiar with, some that are going to reframe some of the things like quarantine and isolation and case and contact, and how those are looked at through the lens of monitoring. We're going to summarize the day-to-day SARA alert experience for those exposed or infected, those contacts and cases. We're going to make sure that you all have a clear understanding of the value of those daily wellness checks, what a daily wellness check is, how it differs for a case and contact on the timeline, what's the same. We're going to differentiate between the communication options they have. Some of these are concepts you're very familiar with, especially when it comes to exposure notification and the guidance, which we're already familiar with. And then finally, we're gonna leave at the very end before we have some testimonial examples. We're going to discuss the role of the assessment interview and specifically drill down on the differences between guidance, monitoring, and exposure notification. Again, with a focus on that monitoring part, because again, that's a part of the job that we participate in on a daily basis. So here's some key terms. SARA Alert is a open source tool that was developed by public health experts for public health. It's used for monitoring and reporting symptoms and resource needs for individuals. The SARA Alert system specifically uses text messages and emails with web links, and it's complemented by the phone calls that we make, the daily wellness check phone calls that we make on the SARA Alerts teams. The isolation monitoring, those are for your cases. So when your cases go into their isolation period, it's the timeline of actions taken by the investigators, which in this context are known as public health enrollers, to make those daily phone calls. Also, when those daily texts or email responses come back with symptoms and resource updates, we're confirming and verifying those. Same thing goes for the exposure monitoring. That again is the timeline for the contacts after they leave the assessment interview. Same idea. Many of the same concepts involved. The only real difference there is that, as we'll talk about later on, exposure monitoring can lead into isolation monitoring if the contact becomes symptomatic and ill. Daily wellness checks, or DWC, that's the communications that we complete every day during the isolation or quarantine period with those individuals that are either in isolation or in quarantine. And one of the things that I really want you to see the correlation with as we use these different terms is that isolation and isolation workflow and cases, those are all synonymous with one another. Cases go into isolation and cases go into the isolation workflow. And our contacts go into the exposure workflow and they're in quarantine. So these are all terms that as you think about this, you need to realize that they're all different halves of the same coin. Preferred reporting methods, as we look through the different options in the, specifically in the SARA alert system, but also these options are common in the guidance and exposure notification options that we have. They have telephone calls, SMS texted web link options, SMS text message options, email web link option, and then of course to opt out. And then finally, for guidance and resources, not just at that initial phone call, but throughout this process, it's important to remember as we're reaching out to them, they're going to have access to updated guidance from the DOH. They're going to have access to resources on a daily basis. SARA alerts follow-up, that follow-through is about ensuring on a day-to-day basis of isolation or they're out of quarantine. It's about making sure that they still have access to those resources and, up to including emergency services. So far, if there's any questions, Mary, just chime in. Of course, I'm looking at the big screen, so I can't see the chat. And here's a pictograph that's generated by the SARA Alerts project. It walks through the 4 primary steps of how SARA Alerts works. First, you get COVID-19 or you spend time with someone who has it. That's either being a confirmed case or having been exposed to contact. Secondly, you're enrolled in SARA Alerts and asked to check in daily. Remember again, SARA Alerts is that monitoring part of this. It's when you're going through portal and you're going through that assessment interview and you're in the tab before you collect contact. This is when you're asked about the guidance contact information and you're asked about the monitoring information. And we'll go through that again in depth later on, but it's important to remember if you're thinking about that portal interview, what part of the portal interview this affects. Then each day that individual is going to get a reminder to check in with SARA Alerts. This is how they're going to report their ongoing symptoms, and it's going to report back to us. And it's either that phone call or those web links through the SMS messaging or through an email, or as you'll see as we get into this, preferably through a phone call. And then when they're done quarantining or they're in isolation, they're done with SARA Alert. One of the things that we work with that maybe we don't see so much on the assessment side of things through portal is we do also end up dealing with international travelers who are being held in isolation or quarantine until the period of isolation and quarantine passes before they can continue traveling. So here's a breakdown of the timeline. If you look at this, take a moment to just examine it. One of the things you'll notice is once again how this mirrors what we learned in training originally for the isolation and quarantine period. Exposure monitoring, that very first day after the assessment call is made, hopefully it's that next day, sometimes it's a couple days. Somebody from the SARA Alerts team will reach out, or they'll get that first text, or they'll get that first email. And it's introducing them to the process and letting them know that once again, every day, they need to either self-report or through the phone call report their symptoms. It's also going to give them the opportunity to ask for resources. And it's going to happen every day of the process until they exit that exposure monitoring workflow 14 days later. If at any point in time during that exposure monitoring, they have symptoms arise, that's when we're going to move them into the isolation monitoring workflow. We're going to make sure that we've given them that updated guidance, and we're going to make sure that they know how important it is to have that room to themselves and access to resources without being in close proximity to people. And they're going to start right over again. They're going to move into that isolation monitoring workflow. One of the things to keep in mind here is you could make it 7 or 8 days into your exposure monitoring workflow and get kicked down into the isolation monitoring and start all over again. One of the things that was brought to our attention by the Department of Health recently, one of the epidemiologists updated us, is that once in isolation, the maximum amount of time that we keep them in isolation on this follow-up through this monitoring process is 20 days. It can go longer than that, but the DOH is going to have to get involved and make that determination. Mary, do you have any questions so far?
Nope, nothing in the chat.
Thank you. So here's the two big questions we ask every call, and are also the two big questions that are addressed in those web links and the emails and the SMS. How are you feeling today? The primary objective there is to collect symptoms. If they haven't changed, wonderful. And if they have, how they've changed. Have they gotten worse enough that they might require emergency services? Is it changed if they're in the exposure workflow where they're a contact? If there's symptoms, that means, like I said in the previous slide, they're going to move into that isolation workflow. And then we reassess the timeline continuously as they approach the end of their exposure period or they reach the end of the isolation period, one or the other. We're going to decide whether or not they're going to be able to exit at that 10 and 14-day mark, or in the case of an isolation workflow, it's extended a little bit to give them those extra day or two to recover. And then the second question is, how can I help? So after we ask how they're feeling, we ask how we can help. And that's about connecting them with resources. You got to remember, we will escalate resource needs at that initial interview. But just because someone didn't ask for help with groceries or rent or medical supplies, that initial interview, oftentimes it's because of the shock of having just found out that they're infected or just found out that they were exposed. And in that moment, they didn't really have it together enough, that presence of mind to ask for the help. And sometimes resource needs change. So during the isolation and exposure period and that workflow, on a daily basis, we're asking how we can help. What resources can we connect you with? You asked for resources yesterday. Have you received a phone call? As you all know, depending on the LHJ and what part of the state they're in, some folks, it takes longer for those resources to get to. Part of that process of making sure that if folks are not responded to, if there's a way we can help, we do. And as you saw in the example with Olga in both the slide, and those of you who saw the post from a few weeks back that I posted praising her presence of mind with that individual who needed someone to call 911, connecting emergency services and making those phone calls to the local medical services to help folks, it's definitely on the spectrum of things that are done when you're a SARA alerts monitor or a public health enroller. One of the other concerns that obviously a lot of folks have is how to identify whether an incoming call is a scam or it's not legitimate. And right out of the gate, SARA Alerts has the phone number that you can expect to receive all text messages from. So whether it's the SMS web links. So when we refer to SMS web links, I'm talking about a smartphone, Android, or OS phone. And an SMS text message, there's also that option for those old T9 flip phones where you can receive a text message the old-fashioned way. And then there's the email option. And those email options, the emails will always come from notifications@saraalert.org. And then, of course, the link out is always going to be to that link listed there. I'm going to make sure to have a PDF of this by the end of the day for everybody to use as reference. But when you speak to folks, if they want to know where to expect this contact from during monitoring, this is the contact information they can look at. And then, like with most scams, not just SARA Alert, they're never going to ask for a social security number or bank account or credit card numbers. They're never going to ask for passwords. No one's ever going to threaten to arrest them or ask them to pay for anything. Those are dead giveaways in all circumstances that something's not right. Then just to reiterate, the phone number will come from the email address. And then when we make those phone calls, which we're going to be getting to shortly, the telephone call options are going to come from they come from the Twilio phone bank. So it's an area code 360 number unique to the public health enroller. Once they get that initial phone call, they tend to stay with the same individual for multiple days at a time. Oops. Right now, when we're doing these daily wellness checks or we're getting the monitor preferences during the interviews, those assessment interviews, the most common is text. And I'm not sure, none of us are really sure whether or not that's really what, if given all the information, is ultimately what 47% of choose. But you'll see that only 11% are phone calls, and looks like there's a smattering of other categories here that are in the mix. And of the choices here, really, we want to make sure that as close to 100% are picking phone call, text, or email so that we know that monitoring is being chosen. These resources are too important and too valuable for folks to not participate. So participating in monitoring in any way through any of these reporting methods of phone call, text, or email is just really, really critical part of all of our jobs. And phone calls would be great. I think everyone has a basic understanding of how much easier it is to actively connect with someone, especially if they're not feeling well, and ask how they're feeling and ask how they're doing and ask what their needs are if you can be on a phone call. But right now, it looks like we're just predominantly text messages, and hope to kind of move away from that in the direction of maybe the phone calls. And so here's the role of the assessment interview in all this. Broken into three categories as far as when you present the idea of monitoring to a case or contact during the interview. It's presenting the information, it's presenting, identifying, and encouraging. So with the individual in our community in mind, it's important to focus on three primary objectives when addressing monitoring with a case or contact. Present the benefits of daily monitoring. Why is it of value to them? What are they going to get out of it? Is it going to improve their situation? Is it going to make their time in isolation or quarantine better? I think most of us would agree it would, especially with the access to resources. Identify the reporting method that will result in favorable outcome and best compliance. This is really important. You'll hear me say a couple of times, probably more than a couple times, how I prefer, and I think a lot of folks would prefer, having the individual pick phone calls for monitoring. But what's most important is that they identify that reporting method that will actually be the thing they'll stick through the entire isolation or quarantine period. So even though there may be a preference for the phone call, that's really not as important as them just what's going to work. Are you going to make those texts? You going to respond to texts every day? Great, let's do the text. Are you old school and you want to do email? Great, let's do email. Are you really old school and you truly understand the value of human contact in a phone call? Great, let's pick that. But ultimately, the best reporting method is the one they're actually going to use and they're not going to give up on. And then finally, encourage the potential monitoree to consider the phone calls to improve the quality of feedback and the quality of service provided to them over the course of the isolation of quarantine. But remember, the primary goal is participation, no matter the chosen method of reporting. When you're presenting the monitoring, I put together not really a script, but just a point of inspiration for how I would, if it was me, present this to a case or contact. So when you get past the guidance and then you moved on to the monitoring question, I would say something to the effect to ensure you have access to resources and to determine when your isolation quarantine will conclude, you can receive daily phone calls unless you prefer a daily text message or email. Important part there is that you explain to the individual what their benefits are from this. It's about having access to resources, and it's about reassuring them that when their isolation and quarantine will conclude. But then it's also at the end, while mentioning the daily phone call, it's also giving them all their options. It's phone calls, text messages, or email. You will have the option to modify that method of communication and refuse at any time during your isolation quarantine. And then finally, at the end, as in all good communication, do you have any questions about this before someone reaches out the next day or so? And I bet you a lot of folks will. So here's what it looks like and what the outcome is and how this connects between the portal interview, when you folks are first making contact with the case or contact, and what they get, what's happening on their end. So during the guidance question, which is the first question that you encounter in the portal, You're going to ask whether they like to have important information sent to them, what phone number they want to receive it, what email, and do they prefer it mailed or emailed? And it can be mailed to them as well. But what they get is they get one of these sets of sheets. They get a fact sheet. And these fact sheets are unique to cases versus contacts. One is 2 pages of guidance from the Department of Health with what to do if you have confirmed or suspected COVID-19. The second one for contacts is what to do if you were potentially exposed to someone with a confirmed coronavirus disease. I don't know how many of you have actually opened these up in the investigator's toolkit, but underneath the interview tab in the toolkit or in the SharePoint, you'll find both of these documents. And they haven't been updated in a while, so they seem to be pretty reliable as written, but this is what they're going to receive by text. It's what they're going to receive by email. And and I'm not sure if they still do or not, but at one point in time, they were also mailing these out. This is what they would mail. They would mail out a paper copy of these. So this is what the guidance gives them. Whatever contact information you provide, this is the outcome. If you choose email, or you choose text, or you choose physical street address snail mail, this ends up in their hands. Real simple. Monitoring. Receive this communication by text message, email, or phone call. This is what's going to lead to those daily wellness checks. So it's important to keep in mind that they may want to receive their guidance in the mail, or they may want to receive their guidance in a text, or they may want to receive it in an email, but this is a completely different animal. This is how they plan on following through on their isolation or quarantine period for the next 10 or 14 days or longer. Picking this and making this selection, this is the point in the process where I would encourage everyone to take a moment and explain to them what the consequence of this decision is. As you battle through this recovery, or you go through this period of time monitoring whether symptoms come on if you're exposed in your contact, how do you want to do that? Do you want to be responsible to respond to an email every day? Do you want to be responsible to respond to a text every day? Or would you prefer to reach out to you and have that human connection every day? I think you'll find especially how common it is for people in isolation to be lonely. I think this is a key moment where if you explain to them that this is going to be the opportunity to actually talk to another human being every day, I think you might be surprised how often people will pick the phone call. And then finally, again, as we're differentiating between these 3 categories where you determine whether someone is texted or emailed or called, final category and the last thing that happens, and this is on the contact tab and portal, is exposure notification. This is where you gather that information as far as having enabled their smartphone for exposure notification and having them get that code, that verification code for confirming contacts anonymously. But this is completely different part of the process than the guidance or monitoring. And again, I just touch on this so that you can separate and different, even though it's part of your workflow, so that you can understand that when you're doing that monitoring, you're doing that guidance, the outcome is a different outcome. It's a different purpose and a different set of questions that I would encourage each and every one of you to ask the individual as you're talking to them.
Hey, Brian, we have one question real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
When signing up for monitoring and you have like a family, so you're doing some household contacts, should you sign up each contact that wants monitoring separately, or should you just sign up one person?
Sign them all up. When we get them in this, and you can correct me if any, Mary, you've been doing a little bit longer than me, so hopefully I'm correct on this, and if I'm wrong, go ahead and step in. But when we receive these individuals to follow up with on SARA alerts, we end up having household members, and they all have different information unique to them. They have phone number and email address and all that. But if you gather all that information for each one of those individuals when prompted for the monitoring, it's going to give us the best opportunity to get a hold of them and follow through on the process. And when we call a household, let's say there's 5 people in a house, we're not going to call all 5 of them. They're all going to get grouped together in the SARA alert system, and we'll make one phone call and we'll ask how each individual person is doing, and typically with that spokesperson for the house we call head of household.
That's exactly correct. Yep.
Thank you. Anything else?
That's the only
Perfect.
question so far.
Perfect. We'll have more questions at the end too. I've got some questions I want to ask of you guys. So we're going to jump into some testimonials here. And these are testimonials specific to the after the fact monitoring, the SARA alerts call, and the resources, and essentially just that we maintain that line of communication with all these cases and contacts. There was a specific case who only spoke Spanish. As I built a trusting rapport, I probed to see if there was anything else I could assist them with. They entrusted me to ask for financial support and assistance with groceries. I provided them with the necessary phone numbers and information when I called the next day to do a quick follow-up. I discovered that the case was not able to get the assistance necessary because there was no one that spoke Spanish at their local health jurisdiction. I quickly informed my supervisor, and they were able to escalate the case to DOH. The following day, the individual did report that someone from DOH called them in their native language and was able to get the necessary assistance. That's a really important part of this job, guys. Again, depending on the local health jurisdiction, depending on where we are in the stages of the peaks and valleys of this pandemic, having that ability to reach out to us or have us reach out to them so they can get those resources that are mandated to be available to them, this is their lifeline. It's really, really important. I was calling a case that was a minor and had to speak to a proxy. In talking with the proxy, I found that the mother had gotten sick via her child and was pregnant. She was feeling very sick and scared and didn't know what to do. She wanted Tylenol and hadn't been able to take a test, so there was no case on file for her where they would have asked about resource needs. In that conversation, I was able to offer her links and phone numbers for how to get some of those resources and escalated the case to make sure there was a case file open for her and that someone would be in touch to complete a case interview and address any more concerns she had regarding her pregnancy. For the majority of the phone call, she was crying, and being able to have the freedom to just a ton of information was invaluable. She could just talk and had the skills and knowledge to get that, and I had the skills and knowledge to get her the help she needed without the pressure of having to complete an entire case investigation. That's another thing about these calls, these monitoring calls. It's not just about gathering information on symptoms or gathering information on continuing resource needs. This is about establishing a human connection with someone who may be alone or may be isolated, and they need that connection with the outside world. It can often be that little spark of energy and positivity and human connection that just keeps them going. And these are not demanding calls. Again, it's how are you feeling today and what can I help you with? And this just came across today. This is a very, very encouraging story that hits close to home. A former cohort 8 coworker of ours was away seeing family with her fiance got COVID. One of the CICTs here called him for his CREST interview, and we got him set up with resources. He ended up getting groceries delivered and everything he needed to isolate safely. I wanted to share their story because it seems like we talk to strangers all day, but this time it was part of our family. It's close to home. This affects a lot of our friends and family we know, including our coworkers, and seeing that this process works and that those resources, food, medical supplies, whatever it may be, there's a process there for us to follow through and follow up and make sure that everything is being done to follow through on that guarantee or follow through on the promise of resources being available depending on their jurisdiction and what part of the state they're in. So here's the wrap up. So this is going to be where one at a time we'll just pop through these and I'll have Mary field the answers. Can anybody tell me what 2 questions are part of every daily wellness check telephone call? You getting some responses over there, Mary?
We have one person who said fever.
Okay. I actually just repeated these two questions in the last minute and a half. I tried to say it a few times.
Oops, there we go. How are you feeling today? Yep, that's one of them.
Yep.
Yep, how are you feeling? And do you need any resources? So how are you feeling and what can I do to help? Exactly. Yeah. Yep, there we go.
Yeah, and the important part about this, guys, when we make these phone calls, it's far less formal. You know, the individual making the call, the public health enroller, the investigator, they're going to call and they're going to ask these questions the way they want to ask the questions. You know, it might be, how are you feeling today? Or it might be, what's up, dude? You feeling better? You feeling worse? So long as the idea gets across and the person on the other end has an opportunity to communicate whether they're feeling better or worse or different in any way, that's all we're trying to do. We're trying to gather that information and reach out to them and find out, are you feeling better or worse? And what do you need that we can connect you with? Second question, why is asking for pointed contact information separately for guidance, monitoring, and exposure notification important? In other words, there's 3 different opportunities to gather a phone number or an email address and ask them, do you want a text or do you want an email? Or why is it important that for guidance, monitoring, and exposure notification, why is it important that you collect those separately? And in addition to typing it into the chat, if you want to raise your hand, and Mary can call on you again, since I can't see the raised hands or not, you feel free to raise a hand, have Mary call on you, and you can speak too. It's awful quiet on my end.
Herbert? Bailey? Oh, hand went back then. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Why we ask that is because it's their preferred method that they can commit to. And like for the guidance part, it's like what form do they want to see it, you know, visually, like on a text message, or they want paper or email.
Well, what let me ask you as a
ahead.
follow-up, when you fill out the guidance answer, what is that information going to determine? Is it going to determine what kind of phone calls you get, or is it going to determine what form of communication you'll receive the guidance in written form from the DOH?
I would say that
Sorry, there's a delay. I apologize if I'm talking over you.
I think just basically the guidance gives, to me, I would say it's my preference how I want it. Like, you know, just like we would ask them. I don't know how to, I guess I'm not understanding the question correctly.
The important part here is that when you do the guidance question, what you put in there, only that 2-page document you receive. That's all it affects. So you're going to get a 2-page document if you're a case or a contact. That 2-page document is going to be digital, or it may be mailed to you. That's all that affects. If you put in a phone number and say, I want to receive this by text message, that is the only thing affected by that decision. It has no impact on how you get an exposure notification, and it has no impact on the monitoring. You with me?
Oh yeah, but basically, I guess I'm not explaining it correctly in my head. That's like basically what I'm thinking in my head. But so that each of those are separated, just like what you're saying, is because it's all about preference on that category, and that's the only category alone, right? For the guidance category, monitoring category, and then the exposure category.
Yep. Yeah, and in other words, maybe you want to receive the guidance message, but you still want to receive phone calls. Or maybe you want the guidance emailed to you and you want the monitoring done by text. It's just important that you have it's just important that you slow down long enough to just explain to the individual what the consequence will be, what the eventual cause and effect situation will be for if you decide to do this for guidance, this is how you're going to receive the document. If you choose this for monitoring, this is a 10 to 14 day commitment. And the exposure notification is for receiving that anonymous code for, providing further exposure contact information. Next question. How do the preferred reporting methods differ, and which has the highest likelihood of the individual completing monitoring? Now, first part of this question is pretty simple if you want to explain the different kinds of methods. But even though I may have expressed a preference for a reporting method, I want you to think about the second part of that question, because it may not be as obvious as it seems just because I expressed a preference. So which method of reporting is the one that has the highest likelihood? Any volunteers?
I can answer this one. This is Kathy. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. The preferred reporting method, so there's text, call, and email. And the highest likelihood of the individual completing the monitoring, phone calls.
Kathy, I appreciate you standing in the line of fire, but even though that's my preferred one, the highest likelihood of completion is not one of the three that you prefer. It's the one they prefer. It's going to be unique to the individual. The one that will have the highest likelihood of completion is the one that they, in their lifestyle and their personality, and after they've heard their options, it's the one that they know they can see through to the end. Do I prefer the phone call? Absolutely. Do I think it's easier, and do I think it gives us a better outcome and gathers more reliable information and it has a higher likelihood of guarantee? I do. But if they are going to respond to the web links every day on a text and that works best for them in their life, then that's the best one. If it's better to do email, that's the best one. It's important that if after hearing their options, they have one they like better, that's going to be the one that has the highest likelihood of success. And then this is a personal question for you guys. There's not going to be any wrong answers to this, because after everything we talked about, this is you guys giving some feedback, particularly those of you who aren't familiar with SARA alerts, at least haven't been that familiar. What do you think is the most meaningful and beneficial aspect of monitoring and daily wellness checks from your perspective? And I would love to have some voices of folks that are not on SARA alerts teams. I'd love to hear some of your feedback on this, because fresh eyes and perspective would be wonderful on this.
Anna has her hand up.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. So I didn't realize how personal the monitoring can be, and for me, I find that really meaningful. That, besides the first survey that we give them, which, because as much as we try and build rapport during that first survey, it can sometimes catch people off guard, I know. And so I imagine that following up with these people throughout their quarantine or isolation period would be really meaningful to them, just feeling like an external, support through their illness. I find that really, really, I find that really, really meaningful.
Thank you so much. I think when I first started learning about this, that was one of the things that hit home for me too. And if you ask the folks who make these calls every day on my team and the others, I think that's a big part of what's so rewarding about this aspect of the daily wellness checks, is that you do often get to make phone calls for 4 or 5 days sometimes to the same people, and before you take a day off and you hand them off to someone else. But those relationships that you can form over 4 or 5 days, I have several folks on my team that I have one in particular who set 3 call length records this week, because every time she would call, the same individual was waiting by the phone, looking forward to that phone call, and had so much to talk about. And those are the those are the kinds of relationships that can come out of this, and it's the kind of meaning and value that the cases and contacts that it has to them, particularly when they're scared and they're alone. Yeah, it's pretty fantastic. Thank you. Anybody else?
Diana?
Yeah, I think if it was me doing one of those SARA alert calls, I would just feel so much better about the job I was doing, because, you know, as a CICT, you do your job, you do your best, and you hope, you know, based on the tone of someone's voice that, you know, you hear some gratitude maybe. You hope that you've made an impact and you've been of some benefit to them. But the SARA alert folks, they know that their job makes a difference, and to me that would be the biggest deal from my perspective.
Thank you. I think that's a common takeaway from this. I'd encourage everyone, even if you're not involved in making SARA alert calls, I'd encourage you to carry that attitude and that energy into speaking to someone about the monitoring. You know, you're about to say, by the time you've reached the monitoring question, you're about to wrap up your interview, unless of course you got, you know, 10 contacts, and some of you are superstars at gathering contacts. But if you're at that second to last tab and you're getting that monitoring information, it's one of the last opportunities you have to both connect with that person and also set them up for success, for us, that safety and security that comes with having monitoring after the fact. Anybody else?
Mitch?
Yeah, I think for me, what I consider a really valuable aspect of SARA alert as like a new process that's become way more robust in this pandemic. Contact tracing has existed for a long time, but this sort of daily follow-up in an automated way, reaching out to absolutely everyone who was exposed, all of the contacts were trying to get enrolled in this, even if they're asymptomatic. I think we're trying to help build awareness when we're having the initial contact with people and get this type of a system normalized, so that in the future it just feels normal and part of the government response. If we enroll people who are asymptomatic and get them to agree to the daily wellness check, a certain percentage of them are going to have a really great experience afterwards, much better than they would have if they hadn't been enrolled. You know, they will follow up and talk to someone if symptoms develop later. You know, maybe they will have needs later. Maybe they'll be more encouraged to isolate it rather than go out to the grocery store and get their own groceries, because maybe we'll be able to help get resources to them so they don't have to. And I think that this can save lives. So I think that this is a really cool system that's becoming, you know, more automated. This was like an open source project, just like the exposure notification system, the WA Notify system. So I think that it's really meaningful that our MAC teams are making this work really well and getting all this great feedback and testimonials about it. So yeah, I think this is really great.
Thank you, Mitch.
Carol?
Hi, yes, I just want to say how important I think this conversation is. You probably heard me say it before, but in Massachusetts, we followed up with all cases and contacts through quarantine and through isolation, every day for isolation and every other day. And those relationships, Brian, that you talked about, that people developed were so important. And Mitchell, you make a really good point about getting people used to this. I remember thinking in all my years in human services, I thought, wow, this is the model to actually reach out into families and see what they need. Like, who does that, you know? I mean, usually people have to hang on phone calls, you know, on busy signals to get what they need. So, so it's such a great model. And I love the way you said, Brian, try to keep that energy with you in this conversation, and imagine, saying, we really want to, to help you, to make sure, maybe there's something you think about that you might need in 3 days from now, or and we want to be there for you, that kind of thing, and take that energy to those phone calls, knowing what's behind it is to just make sure their families get what they need, and feel safe.
Thank you. Yeah, the thing that is important to remember is that this after the fact monitoring covers the spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, if someone's very sick, maybe short of being in the hospital, they're very ill. This is the very fringe of palliative, complex illness that we're trying to deal with. And folks aren't sure whether or not they need to go to the hospital or call 911. And on that end of it, it's very medical and it's very detail oriented as far as trying to figure out how severe it is and if we need to call for help. And again, it's very palliative. But vast majority of these, we're dealing with mental health issues, and we're dealing with that human connection and isolation and loneliness. And having the opportunity to convey that to somebody who maybe when you're talking to them, they're not feeling that symptomatic at all, or they're not taking it that seriously. Just conveying to them that if they're going to abide by the guidance that they're being given, there's going to be value in having that daily connection, that lifeline, if you will, that ability to connect with someone else, either by text or by an email, or better yet, by a phone call, and not have to go through this next 10 to 14 days or a little longer. They're going to have someone else on their side, and they're not going to feel like they have to carry it all on their own shoulders. Well, with that, unless we have, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, can I add something? So I'd just like to thank you for this training, because after it, I feel like I understand the SARA alerts a lot better. And I'm interested in integrating that into my calls. So from the perspective of a CICT, when I get to the questions about monitoring, I will now be able to explain to them what monitoring is and the value that it'll have to them. So I can maybe encourage a phone call, because that's where you would get the most personal connection, or convince a lot more cases to not decline monitoring. So thank you for that, because I feel like now I can do a much better job, in my role, getting people that connection as well.
Well, I am profoundly grateful for that, because all the work that everybody put into this, that's all we want. We just want the guidance and the monitoring, the exposure notification part of the portal interview to just have everyone just take that moment, take a beat, and reflect on what outcome you want for this person you're speaking to, so that you can let them know what their options are and understand the importance of those decisions. So with that, I'm going to make sure that there is a copy of the last 22 slides that have the content on them. And
Brian.
Go ahead.
Hi, Brian. Sorry to interrupt you. This is Anna Marie, and fantastic presentation. Thank you so much, especially for representing all the SARA Alert staff who do this work every day, and all the CICTs who are helping to make sure that the cases and contacts get the kind of monitoring services that they need. Anna set this up beautifully, but can I ask you to show your slide again about the learning objectives? And to, if you're able to, if not, it's going to, I know it'll be part of your presentation, but Anna really did a nice job of summarizing, what you took away from this. And we are going to ask everybody, in their training, really to reflect on the learning objectives. So when Brian does send that out, I do ask everybody to take a look at it, and as you go through it, make sure that you're drawing that information. I think the presentation did a beautiful job of pulling all that out. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I will. I will, as you review this kind of one more time, I will make sure that this is posted somewhere next half hour at the latest.
And Brian, did this get, yes, it's recorded. Good. Okay. Just double check.
Yep, I hit the old record button. As soon as that gets downloaded, I will get a copy of that available for us to post where we need it to.
And ditto what Anna Marie said. It was a great presentation. And I love the engagement of the CICTs, everybody here, and great summary of what the takeaway here, really.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you all very much. I will bid you adieu.
Thanks, Brian. This is fantastic.
Thank you.